We are gonna change the world. We are gonna, bank the unbanked. We are gonna get rid of the banks. We are gonna get rid of all the intermediaries and protect the value of our savings from money printing central banks. Wait a minute. This is the early 90s. I was a know-it-all 15-year-old living in a small fishing village in the northwest of Spain. It was very lucky to get exposed to something called open source. Back in the day, personal computing meant MS-DOS, Windows 3, for those who could afford it, Apple. In the enterprise world, we're talking about mainframes, Unix systems, and all of them had one thing in common. They were proprietary. They were a black box that could you not touch and change and tweak for you to build your own services. This lack of openness and fragmentation stifled innovation. All this infrastructure had not been commoditized yet. The corporations, the Microsofts, IBMs of the world, own all the IP. It had an iron grip on the product roadmap. If you wanted to innovate, the only option was for you to join one of those corporations. By doing so, you'd be restricted to that corporation's talent pool, their commercial priorities, and their product roadmap. Disruption. I just painted a pretty bleak picture of the early 90s in the IT space, but the seed of change had already been planted in the late 80s. There was a movement against the proprietary software ecosystem, and the ethos was that the software that we depend on should be open, that users should have the right to modify it and extend it, to use it as a building block to create new services. This timing was not casual. The internet was taking its first baby steps, allowed the growth of the open source community, and facilitated the exchange of source code beyond computer magazine cassettes and floppy disks. I'm showing my age now. My younger self was literally enthralled and intoxicated with this conflation of networking and openness. These were two key ingredients of what some people call the cyberpunk utopia. So I honestly thought, as a naive 15-year-old, that open source in the internet were to change the world, and that was going to be a really easy journey. That the days of the evil oligarchy of Microsoft, IBM, HP, Hitachi, you name it, were counted. So like Windows, Sun OS would not desecrate our dear Intel CPUs anymore. And open source software would be the go-to operating systems for anything built on the internet. Fast forward 6 years, late 90s. Now open source has already left the academia and the cyberpunk bubble. And now it's a buzzword that is on the radar of the mainstream media, the technology buffs. Also, the valuations of open source companies were going through the roof, and we're having seemingly successful IPOs. But they were ready for a reality check. The lack of governance that we were seeing across the open source ecosystem had brought a lot of patent trolls. It was too much noise. Under these conditions, open source failed to gain any meaningful adoption in the enterprise world where the real money is. Revenues generated by most open source companies were, let's say, underwhelming, despite the fact that we've been working on these for a decade plus. And many in the open source community, including myself, turned out to be a bunch of elitist technologies and open source maximalists. You know the type. You have seen similar people in the blockchain crypto world. Basically, we did not care much about non-power users. Because of that, usability and the creation of an application ecosystem became an afterthought. Surprisingly, open source failed miserably to make a dent in the personal computer market. And to make things worse, in the independent software world, the most ISVs did not even bother to port their applications to open source operating systems like Linux. End result, open source companies, stock prices plummet and or go bankrupt. And adding insult to injury, my parents were still using Windows 95. And they started to get really worried about their geeky zone. Again, there was a need for some of us to grow up. After a decade plus, we had been trying to make open source mainstream, and we had clearly fallen short. And some of us started to recognize the obvious. First, people want useful applications for their personal devices, and they don't care about the underlying technology. They want something that is convenient and safe. If you are an application developer, what you want is a developer-friendly operating system that allows you to create applications that can be monetized. If you're a big enterprise or a government organization, what you want is software that is robust, does not expose you to potential lawsuits related to patent or IP infringement, and that is aligned with the procurement guidelines and IT risk controls. None of this was as exciting or sexy as developing new features or being able to do without evil proprietary software vendors. We're self-serving, and that was alienating all the other stakeholders, from the regular users to the broader software industry. Basically, there were no check and balances whatsoever. The open source ecosystem was sorely missing a proper governance. Here I'm referring to governance framework that could serve to protect all the stakeholders that I just mentioned: developers, independent software vendors, hardware vendors, and most importantly, the end user. The problem is that this requires funding. Who's going to be building all these frameworks and make sure that people actually use them? It is here that we realize that many enterprise users, meaning the big companies, had an itch to scratch. They were desperately looking for a commoditized platform on top of which to build their apps and services, which is what makes them money after all. Some of us felt that it was not a crazy leap of faith to assume that these boring 1,400 companies had very strong incentives to contribute to the development of such a platform, and we decided to move to the corporate world. In my case, it was NTT, the Japanese giant telco. Fast forward to 2007. And finally, after more than 15 years of working on open source, we finally had the Linux Foundation that provided much needed governance and a global patent pool like the Open Innovation Network. Who was bankrolling them? You guessed it. It is 40 global 500 companies. Not only that, these corporations were actively contributing for free source code to projects like Linux and PortSQL that they needed to meet their enterprise requirements. And to close the circle, the open source community itself, that started with a lot of crypto anarchists and the whole cyberpunk community, they were actually accepting these contributions from the dark side, the big corporations. Of course, these private companies were not doing any of this out of altruism. It made sense for them financially and business-wise. This commoditization of Linux as the internet operating system and also databases and other foundational technologies enabled the explosive growth of cloud and mobile computing and also SaaS offering, creating unprecedented shareholder value along the way. Fast forward to 2024. Since the Bitcoin white paper was published in 2008, there has been a lot of hype around DLT and blockchain. But let's be honest, beyond the use of some of the blockchain's native tokens as a store of value, these technologies have been a complete failure in terms of mainstream adoption. We have not disrupted finance in any meaningful manner, and the public, including my wife, is not in a rush to move their life savings and assets out of banks and brokers. So with all these hard lessons from open source and the internet at the back of our minds, we started to conceptualize SBI Digital Asset Holdings. My team and I took a really hard look at what was needed to basically accelerate the digitization of finance. They started in the 60s with mainframes. We came up with 3 basic points that we think are critical in the context of mainstreaming of digital assets and crypto technology in general. One is that we need commoditized open source software building blocks. That's already there. We also need commoditized financial primitives. Please imagine a world where you, as a developer, you can have access to a payment primitive that allows you to settle cross-border transactions without needing to go through a multi-month onboarding process with a traditional bank or financial institution, without needing to go after that over a multi-month system integration process with that bank. That what is already here. That's what DLT technology and blockchain provide today. And the final point, and I would argue is the most important, is the boring part. Here I'm talking about regulation, we're talking about risk controls and governance frameworks. What we're building here is not pets.com. Some of you might be familiar with that website. We're not talking about building a new social media company. The stakes here are much higher. We're talking about a utility. So that is why SBI Asset Holdings, the last 4 years, has been working very closely with global central banks and regulators, as well as private sector partners, on the mainstreaming of this tech by doing not only the sexy part, but also the boring part. And most importantly, as a startup, driving commercialization globally by creating new digital distribution corridors globally. And finally, I would like to close with some words that I tell to my colleagues quite often. If you want to make a difference, please work on the big problems. In many cases, the big problems like changing finance hasn't changed for decades. It's a multi-decade process, and there are no shortcuts. And I want to be honest with you, at times it's pretty painful, and there are a lot of non-sexy parts that you need to take care of, but in the end, they are the most rewarding. Thank you for having me.